It's the IDP show, now you know.
Okay, welcome to the IDP show week 16 rankings episode. I'm your host, Jase Abbey, and I'm joined on today's show by a man who boasts some pretty impressive credentials. In addition to hosting the award-winning Draft Sharks Fantasy podcast, he's Fantasy Pro's two-time IDP accuracy champ, and he's been a finalist for the Fantasy Sports Writers Award. A huge welcome to Matt Schauf, and Merry Christmas, my man. How goes it?
Yeah, Merry Christmas to you. I'm just glad that it was me you were talking about with the impressive credentials. I was worried somebody else was about to jump in and join us.
Too modest. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm really excited to get on the show with you today. I've been waiting for this one for a little while. It's been in the pipeline. Looking forward to mixing it up and just talking some IDP. It doesn't get any better than this, does it? Even in the week immediately preceding Christmas.
I mean, if anything, it's good to get a break from online shopping and getting the house ready for Christmas. I'd much rather talk about defensive players, and especially when, I mean, with all of the content out there, there's still so little. So I'm glad you guys are doing this, and I'm glad that there are folks across the ocean playing IDPs when there still aren't even enough on our side doing so.
Gotta fly that flag for IDP, dude. It's
Right.
It's where it's at, isn't it? So, what do you say to jumping straight into this then and talking about some of these week 16 rankings? We're going to go position by position, discussing some of the guys who we're sort of hyping or fading for the slate of games ahead. So, Matt, let's kick things off by talking about your first featured linebacker. Who do you like this week?
Well, one thing that I always find a little bit tough, strange, like whatever your adjective is gauging exactly where these IDPs sit in terms of perceived value, in terms of how much they're used, even how much they're rostered across sites. Like for the offensive guys, we know pretty well what the perception is on a player, but it surprises me every time that I go down some avenue for trying to figure that out, because we don't really have one solid way to determine it. So I look at the consensus rankings on Fantasy Pros, I look at the rostered rates on Sleeper, and just try to, I don't know, kind of guess from there. So some of the names are going to sound obvious to people, I think, and other leagues you might find these players available. I didn't plan to name Lavonte David as the linebacker that I like this week, because to me, he seems obvious. I mean, he's been playing well since he got back healthy. The Jaguars are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to linebackers, the 3rd most solo tackles to the position. And this matchup is probably going to be even better for Lavonte David if it's CJ Beathard in place of Trevor Lawrence with the concussion, because Beathard adds sack upside. He adds turnover upside. He's got a higher career sack rate than Trevor Lawrence. He's going to be more turnover worthy, I guess, probably more turnover prone. And Lavonte David's gotten some pass rushing chances recently, 7 of them last week, according to Pro Football Focus. He's already matched his season total for pass rushing opportunities in 372 fewer snaps than he had last year. He's already had as many pass rushes. So we've got more sack upside with Lavonte David than we might have had in the past. We've got a good matchup for him. And again, we've got him playing well, 2+ tackles for loss in 4 of the past 5 games. I think even if your league doesn't score tackles for loss, it's a good stat to look at, because it can tell you that an off-ball linebacker is playing well if he's making plays behind the line of scrimmage. In addition to that, he's got passes defensed in 3 of his past 4 games. So we're talking about a cross-category guy. We're talking about a longtime contributor, and I've got him in the top 5. I looked at the consensus rankings. He's sitting something like 15th. So it's not that anybody dislikes him, but I'm telling you, he's somebody that you need to start this week.
I love the call. I've been a long time Lavonte David fan. He's like 33 now, 34, but still one of the best linebackers in terms of his pass coverage skills, which is phenomenal. He's been doing it forever and a day. Like you say, he's been getting more pass rush opportunities as well lately. He's got a couple of sacks in the last 3 games. What's not to love? And that matchup, that's as good as it gets, really. So yeah, all aboard for David. Totally there with you. I don't have him ranked as high as the LB5, but he's within my LB1 range this week. So my featured linebacker is, and this one is kind of a brave call, you might say, but it's Christian Harris. He's my LB 32, up 8 spots from last week. Look, he was flat out terrible last year, like historically bad. 116 linebackers played 100 snaps last year. Out of those 116, PFF rated him 115th in coverage, 114th in tackling grade, and 113th in run defense. So, we try to keep expectations in check with these rookie linebackers. But even so, that was such a bad year that I thought it was going to take a miracle for him to become even close to an every down linebacker. But miracles do happen, Matt, right? He's taken advantage of some injuries to others at the position, Perryman, Cashman, 2020. And he's looked like a totally different guy at times this year. Hasn't done it consistently, but there's been flashes, more than flashes maybe, where he's shown that he can be that guy. He's never going to be an elite run defender. That was never who he was, even at Alabama. But he's playing much better in coverage. He's missing fewer tackles. Put up 8 solos last week with no missed effort. Second week in a row that he's done that. And he did that against what should have been, on paper at least, a poor matchup. But this week, they've got the Browns. The Browns are a great matchup for linebackers. The only caveat here really is if Cashman makes it back. He's questionable. If he does make it back, that will obviously mean fewer opportunities for Harris. But otherwise, I like him all the way. What do you think on Harris, Matt?
What a wild season for that guy. I mean, you mentioned all the issues last year. He did open the season in the starting lineup. And then by week 2, they were like, maybe we don't want to play Christian Harris so much. And then it was all over the place over the next 6 weeks or so. And then all of a sudden, over the past 5, he's been a full-time player, been over 90% playing time in 4 of the past 5, down for one of those. We'll see about Blake Cashman. The last time he was on the field, though, Cashman wasn't the top playing time guy. So I guess my only concern about the Houston LB core is it's just been kind of all over the place. I don't know for sure that we can trust, but 5-game stretch of pretty useful production from Christian Harris. I want to trust it this week too. The matchup's good. It should be good for whoever's on the field. And the way that Harris has been used lately says that we should expect him to at least be one of the top 2 linebackers in this game. I agree that he should be a solid LB3 this week.
Yeah. I think he's better than Perryman, but I've been kind of surprised at how well Cashman has played. Like you say, it has been a little bit all over the place. Obviously, injuries have factored into that somewhat. But yeah, I kind of like him. If Cashman misses time this week, I'd be quite happy to start Harris as like you said, as an LB3, but one that could perform beyond those expectations.
We won't hear anything from reporters about what the plans are at linebacker for Houston, right? Because they don't know that defense exists until game days.
That's it, exactly. So yeah, we're going to be playing rolling the dice a little bit on that one, maybe. So any other linebackers you want to champion this week, Matt?
Yeah, my next guy is on the other side of that matchup for the Browns. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah has been terrific for a while now. Week 10, we saw his playing time rebound from around 50% to 81% in that game. Since week 10, he has not dipped below 79%. In that span, he's second among all linebackers in fantasy points per game, depending on your format, of course. Maybe that differs a little bit, but it probably doesn't differ too much because he's been producing across categories, averaging 7.7 tackles over that span, 1.3 tackles for loss. So again, that's a good measure of how well a guy is playing. He's making tackles behind the line of scrimmage, 2.5 sacks in that time, 3 passes defensed. This matchup gains upside if CJ Stroud is not playing, and that's what's expected to be the case now. So that Houston offense gets shorter range, less explosive, easier for the speedy JOK to catch. It's a matchup that doesn't necessarily look amazing by the numbers, but Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah has been so good lately that you just play him unless there's a reason not to. And I don't think you have a reason not to. He looks like he's way underrated right now versus where he should be. I think he's another guy who should be in that LB1 range.
Yeah, I talked about, I love the guy. Talked about him either last week or the week before, I forget which, but mentioned at the time that I was really high on him After his rookie year, he was kind of like my breakout candidate at linebacker for his year 2, so last year. Slightly disappointed in what he did last year, but he's come back with a vengeance this year. Didn't necessarily start in that way. There was like, we talked about the Houston linebacker situation and the confusion there as to who was going to be the main guy each week. Cleveland was even worse, right? It was Walker 1 minute, Taki the next, Owusu-Koramoah, or just none of them could be reliable until, like you say, a couple of games back, maybe 4, 5, 6 weeks now. All of a sudden, Owusu-Koramoah has emerged as their top option. I think he should be their top option. He's, I think, the most talented of the bunch, and certainly the most modern player in terms of his skill set. Slightly surprised to see Taki beat him for snap share last week with Walker out, but like you say, there wasn't enough of a dent in Owusu-Koramoah's snap share. Still had, 86, 87%? That's not enough to worry me too much. Really like the guy. Really like the call. I haven't got him as an LB1. I haven't quite got him that highly, but yeah, I'm all for Owusu-Koramoah. And he's one of those guys that I try not to show bias in my rankings, but I really want to see him succeed as well.
Yeah, that might be the toughest thing to do, is you're like, I want to rank this guy high, but then when I look at the numbers, I can't quite put him where I want to. So, sometimes it's worth fudging it up a little bit, because there's always, not always, sometimes there's some upside beyond what you can reasonably project. But he's, like you said, he's a player I've liked since he was a prospect. I mean, he was a 2nd round pick, but a speedy guy stepping into a good situation. I hope that this end of season stretch is enough that we finally get him full time from the start of the season next year. But, we'll see. If there's one thing we could trust with Cleveland linebackers lately, it's that we can't trust them.
Oh, for sure. For sure. So do you have any other names you want to throw at me?
I want to throw out Jordan Hicks, and this one's going to take watching him through the week, because as far as we know, even Kevin O'Connell doesn't know if Jordan Hicks is going to be ready to play. But it sure sounds like as soon as Jordan Hicks shows that he's ready to play, Kevin O'Connell's excited to get him all of the playing time again, because he called him the quote unquote heart and soul of the defense in terms of how he communicates, getting everybody into the right position. And this is a team that's trying to fight to get into the playoffs. So I know that Ivan Pace has played well, and Kevin O'Connell praised him too, says he's done a great job filling in for Jordan Hicks as the play caller. But when you're trying to get those last few wins to get into the playoffs, I think you go back to the veteran, maybe you get Ivan Pace more playing time than he had been getting previously. But I think Jordan Hicks is going to get back to full time. And before his injury, which was a shin injury, so, it's one of those where if he proves ready to play, I don't think we should worry about re-injury to it. It's not a knee or an ankle or something like that. I think that when we get Jordan Hicks back on the field, what we had before the injury was a guy who was scoring as a top 6 linebacker. I think it's a bit risky, but I think it's worth the risk to go ahead and put Jordan Hicks back into lineups, as long as you play at certainly at least 2 linebackers, especially if you start 3+.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It makes sense to go with the veteran. Pace, like you say, has played really well. I'm kind of rooting for him in the same way as I was Owusu-Koramoah we spoke about a moment ago. I've got a bunch of Pace in a bunch of places and very little Hicks. So again, some bias on my behalf there. But yeah, it makes sense to go back to the veteran. And it's interesting you should mention Pace, actually. I originally slated him as one of my quick mentions at linebacker that I liked for this week. He was going to be the second guy I was going to mention. I upset someone in the YouTube comments last week when I didn't mention Pace. It wasn't that I didn't like him. I had him as my LB18 last week. But like you say, with Jordan Hicks sort of hopeful he can return, I've pivoted away from Pace to Javon Bentley. Not a sexy name. He only had 4 solo tackles, 7 combined last week. But it was his 5th game in a row with at least 7 combined efforts. And I think he has a chance to flirt with double digits against the Broncos, who have allowed the highest tackle efficiency to opposition linebackers. So Bentley is my number 1, switched it up from Pace. KJ Britt is the second guy I want to talk about. It just sounds like the Bucks and White, in fact, are ready to move on from each other. 3 weeks ago, it kind of looked like Dennis might be the guy to own in terms of who was going to start in White's absence, but it's been all Britt the last 2 weeks. Snap shares been above 90% in both games against the Falcons and the Packers, I think it was. And the results have been pretty nice. Not mind-blowing, but pretty nice. 14 tackles, a sack, a pass breakup over that span. The Bucks face the Jags this weekend. Jacksonville's been a super friendly matchup for opposition linebackers. So I think as an LB3, you could do a lot worse than Britt.
Yeah, it could certainly be an upside shot to take. I'm not sure if I'll get that far. I do like Juwan Bentley's upside a bit better against the Broncos because we've seen the tackle ceiling for him. We know that he's capable of doing that. And I don't think the Patriots are capable of pushing Denver into, a lot of passing as a couple of their recent opponents have done. But I think we'll get into that matchup a little bit more in a few minutes.
Let's talk about some of these linebackers who we aren't so keen on. Who is your featured player here?
I got Jordyn Brooks first, and it looks like, from what I can tell by the market, that the market doesn't love him this week either, but it's for good reason. He's a tackle-heavy scorer, and he's averaging just 3 solos, 2.3 assists over the past 6 games. So if you look at his full season numbers, he still looks solid. You might think of him as a guy that you should just start. We get to this time of year, and people are like, you got to start your studs, otherwise you're going to regret it. And it would be understandable if you look at Jordyn Brooks and think he's a stud. It's just not what he is right now. He is coming off the late season ACL tear, very end of season ACL tear. So I don't think we're getting full Jordyn Brooks. He's also just an okay player in general in real football. Again, hasn't been doing the tackle production lately. And this week's matchup is with that Titans team that you alluded to with the Houston matchup earlier. If you're just thinking about it, you're like, oh, the Titans want to run the ball. That's a great matchup for linebackers. It just hasn't been. They've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to linebackers. So, I mean, maybe it ends up going differently, but if we've got a linebacker who hasn't been producing and a matchup that hasn't been producing, to me, that's a guy that you try to leave on your bench.
I agree with a lot of the points you made there. So firstly, that Brooks is not the player. His performances aren't quite at the level that his production tends to suggest. Wagner is still by far the superior linebacker there, but also, and most importantly for me, this is a good example of how a guy can still be playing 75, 80% of the snaps most weeks and kind of produce, and it kind of lulls us into that false sense of security where we're like, he's playing the vast majority of the snaps. Why should I not start him this week? But over the course of a season, those 10, 15 snaps that he's missing every game do add up, and he begins to lose pace with those leaders at the position. So as efficient as Brooks is most weeks as a tackler, despite not playing every down, that is the biggest issue for me when it comes to him. We know that these guys don't have to play particularly well, so I'm willing to forgive that when we're talking about weekly rankings in most cases, unless there's an idea that they might lose their role the following week. But yeah, like I say, the snap share, that's a big concern for me.
And whether it's Brooks or somebody else, you can get caught up in looking at the season score, or even just thinking about a few weeks ago where that guy put up a big number for you. And that very well might be the case if you've been starting Brooks and you look back to that first San Francisco matchup where he had a pick 6 and he had 12 tackles, and you're like, I can't sit that guy. What if that happens? If you look at his game log, that stands out as a clear outlier among his past 6 games. So, I mean, if you want to bet on the outlier as opposed to the other 5 in that span, that's fine. It might end up working out for you, but I would go with the others as opposed to that.
Yeah. But that history of production makes he's a player that I pause on every week when I come to him in my rankings. I look at where I've listed him and I start to question, he's the kind of guy that I should have ranked a little higher, right? And then I go back to the numbers and I'm kind of reassure myself that where I've got him ranked is okay. So yeah, he's a tough one to rank, actually, Brooks. But yeah, I think we're justified in our sort of outlook on him and having him a little lower than perhaps consensus. So talking of such a guy, here's a name for you. So I'm cooling on Nick Bolton this week and possibly for the rest of this season. He's my LB30 for week 16, one behind Elandon Roberts. Didn't expect to be saying that at the start of the season. I mean, Bolton is a guy who's played a huge role in winning some fantasy championships for managers out there. I know injuries have derailed him this year, and his 2024 season may look very different, but these are weekly rankings. And when he has played this year, he hasn't been the every down guy that we came to expect last year. And while I know that he's a threat to earn more than the 81% snap share he had last week, as he continues to get healthy, I don't want to take that gamble on a player at this point in the fantasy season. This is like business time, isn't it? So Drew Tranquil's back in the mix. Willie Gay continues to leech some snaps. Leo Chenal won't go away. And I think while those three are more likely to cannibalize each other's roles, I want to see Bolton assume that every down role again before I feel comfortable talking about him as anything more than a sort of a solid LB2. In addition, I don't like this matchup against the Raiders. They've allowed fewer than 15 tackles to opposition linebackers per game in 2023, ranking amongst the bottom 5 teams in that sense. So yeah, I want to be higher on Bolton. He's definitely got that name recognition value. Do you think I'm being too harsh, Matt?
I don't. I think that he's fine to be cautious about. We haven't seen much from him this year. Literally, he hasn't been on the field that much. And like you said, the playing time was a bit limited last week. I think we have even still a further skewed view from that game because we just didn't get all that many tackle chances from that New England team. They had 16 carries in that game, 23 completed passes. So, I mean, that's 39 possible tackle opportunities, plays. Obviously, there can be more than one tackle on a play, but, just not a lot of opportunities for him to make plays. Nick Bolton's probably somebody that I'm going to need to think more about during the week and watch for any signals on whether they think he's ready for 100% playing time and probably move him around my rankings. But I think he is totally a fine player to be cautious about right now. And even if at the end of this weekend, you go back and you're like, Nick Bolton got 10 tackles and I left him on my bench. It wasn't the wrong move. We haven't seen enough to say that he was a good bet to get that so far.
You'd have to be pretty loaded, I think, to not start Bolton as like an LB3, but there's no teams on a bye. So if you are going to miss a week of Bolton, this might be it, I think.
Yeah, I'd be worried about sitting him for like a reach start. But if you're comparing him to several other guys that we're talking about in like the top 20, 24, nothing wrong with playing others ahead of Nick Bolton this week, I don't think.
Yeah. So who else are you fading for week 16 at the linebacker spot?
I am not as high as it seems like the market is on Tremaine Edmunds. And, it's understandable why you'd be high on him right now. And when I say market, he's LB12 right now in the Fantasy Pros consensus. I'm sure we're going to have lots more sets of rankings going in. Mine aren't in there right now. So that'll drag him down some. But he's LB12 there, and I don't think he deserves that. And you might think I'm crazy if you look at his recent fantasy scoring, because the past 4 weeks have included LB1 overall, LB12, and LB18 finishes for Edmunds. But he had interceptions in each of those games. He had a pick 6 last week against Cleveland. So that's really inflating those numbers. He's averaging 4.5 solo tackles over that span, 2.75 assists. Those are fine. And I think he's fine. And if you're valuing him this week as fine, then I think you're doing fine. But if you think that Tremaine Edmunds is the 12th overall linebacker, that means you're playing him ahead of guys we've talked about, like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, like potentially Lavonte David. And I think that if you play Tremaine Edmunds over Lavonte David this week, you're going to wind up very disappointed by Monday.
Yeah, I agree. And that might surprise some of our audience because I talked up Edmunds last week in what should have been a pretty good matchup for him. I agree, though. LB12 is too high for him. I've got him down at LB20. And the tier that he's in, realistically, I could interchange anyone from sort of the LB10 spot down to like the LB24 spot. These are all full-time guys. They're kind of like ranked where they are because of matchup, form, health in some cases. But yeah, LB12 is too rich for me. There's too many other guys who have been more reliable, consistent, and productive this year that you'd be ranking him ahead of, as you said. So I'm going to take some stick for this one, but I've gone with Khaleke Hudson. Now, before people take the pitchforks out, I have to admit I've cheated on this one a little bit. I don't dislike him. I just don't like him as much as everybody else seems to. And some of that might be just a problem with my perception, but I've seen a lot of talk about him this week. And I think we need to kind of temper those expectations a little bit. You've got to give him credit for what he did. 14 tackles was crazy, came from nowhere to essentially replace David Mayo as Jamin Davis, his replacement. Monster game, but he's not an every down guy. And that 21.9% tackle efficiency he had last week, that's not sustainable. And the Jets team that he's playing this week rank amongst the worst teams in terms of tackle efficiency to opposition linebackers, irrespective of who their starting QB has been. So for those reasons, I'm just saying, let's just pump the brakes a little bit on Hudson this week. I've got him ranked down in my LB40 range. I forget where example, LB47. So I'm thinking of him as an LB4, really, a low end LB4 this week, which will upset some people. It's just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, one game is awesome. Maybe it signals what he's going to do this week. It's also one game. Maybe it doesn't at all. Maybe he doesn't ever get another game of more than 50% playing time this year, because that's the only time this season that he's seen it. And, if you can't get ahead of Cody Barton and David Mayo before week 15, then it's a signal of something more than the coaches just forgetting that you're on the team.
And just to be clear, I'm picking up Hudson in every league that I'm in where I need linebackers. I don't think Barton is irreplaceable by any stretch. So I'm picking up Hudson in the hope that if I make it through the next round of the playoffs in my leagues, then I just want to be one step ahead of the game. I'm just not starting him this week unless I'm really desperate.
Yep, totally agree with that. Yeah, I mean, Cody Barton's so awesome that the team that started him all of last year let him walk in free agency to Washington.
Yeah, he's talking about just a guy. He's the definition of that of that description, really. So, who else do you have at linebacker who you're not so keen on this week? Anyone?
Frankie Lulu is usually a guy that I like, often above where the market likes him, but I don't really like him this week. He's down in low LB3 range. His pass rush chances are down over the past 2 weeks, including one against Atlanta last week. Part of that is playing Atlanta, and Atlanta, I don't know, plays 1920s football. But it was the week before. Frankie Lulu has not been getting as many pass rush chances, which is really the biggest draw to his game. He has more upside in that area than the typical off-ball linebackers. Even if he gets a few more of those opportunities this week, Jordan Love has the 7th best sack rate among qualifying quarterbacks, so it's not a great matchup for sack upside. And overall, the Packers are allowing the 2nd fewest LB fantasy points per game. So just not a great spot. And Frankie Lulu is not a reliable enough scorer that you say, forget the matchup, I'm playing Frankie.
He's also my second guy. I really like him in certain scoring formats, where we emphasize sacks and QB hits above tackles, perhaps, but he's kind of struggled down the stretch, had that big sort of first 2 weeks of the year, 4 sacks in his opening 2 games. Only 2 in the 12 games since. Just hasn't rushed the passer as often as he has last year. He's roughly around about half of his total pass rush snaps so far in the season. I know we've got a couple games yet to go, but you'd hope that would help him in terms of his tackle efficiency, but that's not really been the case either. It's frustrating as he is around the ball a lot, but a lot of his tackles have come by way of assists relative to his number of solos compared to other linebackers, at least. So the Packers haven't been a good opponent for opposition linebackers in terms of tackle efficiency and tackle volume. They allowed very few sacks as well, as you pointed out. So yeah, for both of those reasons, I'm also out on Lulu this week. And when we talk about being out, I'm not completely out on the guy. I still got him ranked as like LB3, high end LB3. This is not going to be his best week, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would probably play Frankie Lulu still over Khaleke Hudson, but it's down in that range where it's a decision. And if you want to go Hudson, I think that's fine. Lulu, has quietly been dealing with multiple injuries this year, so perhaps that's impacting his performance. I don't know if he's sat out a game yet. I don't think he's sat out a game, but he's been questionable multiple times with varying things. So he might be one of those guys that we find out after the season, oh, he was playing through this for 10 weeks. We'll watch for that, but for now, he's not a great option for week 16.
Agreed. So look, that's enough linebacker talk. Let's switch focus to these defensive linemen, Matt. So which DT or edge player are you hyping for the week ahead?
This is another one of those where I talk about figuring out the guys that you need to focus on. Cause I do my waiver wire article at the beginning of every week. And a lot of times I just pass over guys, assuming that they're on a roster in most leagues. Quinnen Williams, though, is a guy that was surprisingly under rostered, I would say. And I think that, if you play in a league that requires defensive tackles, he's probably been on a roster all season, probably been in a starting lineup all season. So not going to matter for there. But I think this week's matchup is good enough that Quinnen Williams matters for every league that plays defensive linemen. And he might well be on the waiver wire in some leagues like that because he's outside of the top 35 in DL scoring for the season. He hasn't had big numbers lately, but he's had some of those hidden pressure numbers, 3 straight games with 2 quarterback hits. Now he gets Washington, which leads the league in pass attempts. So there's opportunities. 3rd most sacks allowed, still good at letting people hit Sam Howell. Sam Howell is still good at letting people hit him. 4 of Washington's past 5 games have specifically included sacks by interior linemen. That included 1.5 from Miami's Zach Sealer, who might be a defensive end in your league's format, but he's an interior lineman that he's like a 3-4 D end, close to what Quinnen Williams plays. 2 sacks for Dallas's Jonathon Hankins, who's a straight up defensive tackle. Quinnen Williams is just one of the best players in that area of the field. It doesn't guarantee he's going to produce for you this week, but he also does have multi-sack upside. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Quinnen Williams finishes this week as like a top 5 scorer for the position.
Like you say, the sack numbers haven't always been there, but the pressure numbers have. And we know that the sacks will follow, assuming he continues to bring pressure at the rate that he is. I mean, just looking at it now, Justin Madubuike has had 57 pressures and 13 sacks. Quinnen Williams has had 6 fewer pressures, but only 4 sacks. That will even out over time. It's just a question of whether that can happen in time to help you this year. So if you got him, though, you start him, especially this week, for the reasons you mentioned, Matt. I like that a lot. So my guy in this spot is Bryce Huff, someone else I've been talking about for over a season now. He's my edge 20, DL 23, up 13 spots from last week, which is a pretty steep climb. It's really easy to make a case for Huff. He ranks behind only Micah Parsons in pressure rate amongst all edge or interior guys this year. It's the 2nd season, in fact, where he's ranked amongst the best in that category. In terms of production, he's only been held back in the past by the fact that he's played such a small role relative to other edge rushers. And this season, he started in a similarly small role again to start the first sort of 4 or 5 games, I think it was. But as the seasons unfolded, the Jets finally realized how talented he is. His role has expanded, and with it, his production's increased. 56 pressures, 8 sacks, and the 10th highest win rate amongst all edge guys. So, yeah, the Jets have the Commanders this week. You talked a moment ago about the fact that they're still struggling on the offensive line, got slightly better as the season's gone on. I still think this week, the Jets pass rush, I can't see that Washington offensive line holding up. And I think if Franklin Myers does miss time, that helps Huff even more. He's going to get an even bigger role. There's nothing not to like about this situation.
Yeah, Bryce Huff's one of those guys that every so often when you're doing the rankings, you're like, man, I didn't realize just how good a season that guy is having. And I think the fact that they're both Jets so far points to this matchup because, Jase, there are probably people who are like, yeah, Quinnen Williams has been on a roster in my league all year. Or people who are like, who the hell is Bryce Huff? There's a wide range of leagues. There's a wide range of scoring formats. So, it's important to kind of lay that groundwork for what the matchup is and then try to fit it to your league. That's one thing that we do on draftsharks.com in particular is we have you sync your team and then we show your actual waiver wire in your league. So, if 2 doofuses are sitting on a Wednesday and talking about players that don't matter to you at all, either because they're already on a roster or they would never be on a roster, then you can at least take the matchup and go and look at who might be available in your league.
I love that you guys do that because, like you say, it's all about context, isn't it? There's been this sentiment in the past that people should play with massive rosters, and that's the only way to play in super complex scoring settings. If that's not your thing, as long as you're playing IDP, I love it. Like if you're starting 1 or 2 guys, I love it. And that's how most people get into playing around with IDP, isn't it? So the fact that you guys do that, you sync the leagues, you give them contextual advice based on what their specific settings and roster sizes is, that's brilliant as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there is no one way to do any of this. If that's what somebody's telling you, then that person is either lying or an idiot.
Just really stubborn, maybe. I used to try and encourage people to do the same thing myself, but now I think people should just enjoy it how they want to enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely enjoy it how you want to enjoy it. I would encourage people to move at least beyond the 3 IDP starters, because that's still at the point where everybody can find plenty of people. And to some degree, it's nice for everybody to have an easy time finding guys worth starting, but there's got to be some kind of challenge as far as I'm concerned, at least a little bit.
So who else should we be starting on the defensive line in week 16?
We talked about matchups in general. I think the Colts are another team to like in that area. And I think Samson Ebukam is a player that has not been getting enough credit for what he's doing this season. He's sitting 37th in early Fantasy Pros consensus. He's sitting 18th in points per game, at least by the balanced scoring format that I was looking at. That's 3 sacks to every solo as far as the scoring goes. Scoring is going to vary widely, but if you favor sacks even more, he's probably sitting even higher. Using that balanced scoring just over the past 4 games, Ebukam has had finishes of DL24, DL4, DL6. So he should be a starter in most leagues for this week's matchup against Atlanta, which is a top 8 scoring matchup for D linemen. I mentioned with Frankie Lulu that the way that Atlanta's running its offense might cut down on the pass rush chances because they just might not pass the ball that much. We'll see what game script says about this week. But even if that's the case, there are plenty of tackle opportunities. Ebukam's on the field all the time. He's been putting up numbers. Atlanta has the 8th worst sack rate in the league. So when they do throw, they're susceptible to those sacks. And then beyond this week, we've got another positive matchup with the Raiders in week 17. So if your league is ignoring Samson Ebukam, then go ahead and make them pay for it by grabbing a guy that you can start this week and next week. And, in terms of that availability, he's rostered in 4% of sleeper IDP leagues. For further context, Zaire Franklin is rostered in 88%. So the fact that Franklin's not 100% shows you that there's some, margin for error there, but 4%, there's no margin for error that makes that an acceptable rate of rostering.
No, there's not. And he's been really getting it done lately, hasn't he? I think he is the most talented edge rusher on that Colts roster. I know that he's kind of like not struggling for snaps, but he's competing with guys who are inferior to him as pass rushers. And I would include Kwity Paye in that group as well. I know Odeyingbo's had a lot of sacks, but hasn't had the pressure rate to sustain those sacks. I mean, I was looking at guys who have the highest finishing rate. So the lowest amount of pressures, the highest amount of sacks. And I think Odeyingbo has the best rate amongst all edge rushers, which to me is a bit of I actually quite like the player, but it's a bit of a red flag. Ebukam is not that same guy. He's been bringing the pressure. He's been delivering sacks, 6 in the last 4, 5.5 in the last 4, something like that. Yeah, I like that call. I want to say I disagree with you on at least one, Matt. So it doesn't sound like we're completely in sync all the way through this, but you're making good arguments and coming up with players who I consider to talk about in the same spot.
I'll see if I can toss you a crappy one at some point.
Yeah, throw in a curveball at some point. So this one might be that guy. My next guy is Za'Darius Smith. He's someone who's caught a little flack recently on the Week 16 waivers episode of the IDP show. And I can understand why, but I want to offer a slightly different perspective. So we're used to seeing double-digit sacks from him every year. So obviously 4 this year is really disappointing, but he's still bringing pressure. And I am cherry picking here a little bit, but he had 7 last week against Chicago, 5 against the Broncos in week 12, 13 in a 3-game span between weeks 8 and 10. I think he's been a little unfortunate not to record more than 4 sacks despite registering 49 pressures. Talked about finishing rate a minute ago with Odeyingbo. I think the opposite end of that scale, Smith, 49 pressures, only 4 sacks. He's been really unfortunate. And I think he's got a chance to set the record straight this weekend against the Texans. They've struggled to protect CJ Stroud or Case Keenum in recent games. And I also like the fact that Okoronkwo is struggling. I don't like the fact, but as far as Smith is concerned, Okoronkwo's struggling with that pec injury, meaning Smith might see a slightly heavier workload. So it's not going to be a trendy pick, but I'm not as down on Smith as some seem to be.
First of all, I think it's really rude that you said you're happy that Okoronkwo was hurt, but trying to move beyond that, Smith's probably not a guy that I'm getting to because he doesn't have the tackles to lay the floor for us to hope for that sack luck to turn around. And it's been a little bit inconsistent for me to count on a true breakout. I think the other factor that's Brown specific is the defense has been really good at getting offenses off the field, and that has actually hurt their pass rushing opportunities overall. To some degree, it's obviously not killing it, but I think Za'Darius Smith is a low level, take a shot if you need a guy in a third spot. He's probably not going to make it into like strongly usable range for me.
Fair points. So who else do you have in this spot? Other defensive linemen who you think we should be starting or at least considering this week?
This is another team spot that I think is a matchup where you can use it on multiple players. And the multiple players I'll mention are Jonathan Cooper and Baron Browning for the Broncos against the Patriots. Cooper has just 1 sack over his past 4 games. Browning has just a half sack over that same span, but they have 10 and 9 total pressures apiece over just the past 2 weeks, according to PFF. The Patriots have allowed 18 sacks over their past 5 games. That's the same amount as they allowed in their previous 9 games. They're averaging 3.6 sacks allowed over that span. Jonathan Cooper is well ahead of Baron Browning in my rankings because he has been the better tackle bet. So that lays the higher floor for him. He has been a bit better on pressure rate as well this year. But I think both of these guys carry multi-sack upside into this game. These are the kind of, no, these are 2 specific players that I think are worth betting on making that jump from hidden pressure to sack production this week.
Yeah, so I was kind of out on Cooper at one point earlier in the year, specifically when Browning came back, because I thought Browning coming back would dilute the role of both Cooper and Benito. But as good as all 3 guys have been at times at getting after the quarterback this year, I think it helps that Benito's a little banged up this week. And Cooper's kind of been getting it done, hasn't he? As you pointed out. So yeah, I'm coming around. I actually think Browning's a better player, pass rusher, certainly, than Cooper. But you make a good point about the weekly floor provided by the tackle volume. So,
yeah, I agree. And I did the same thing with Cooper when Browning came back. I had knocked him down, and there were probably a couple weeks where he was lower than he should have been because of that reaction and I guess delayed correction. So this week I've got it corrected. Jonathan Cooper's up inside my top 20.
So this one's a reach from me. I know it, but it feels the right time to talk about Malcolm Koonce. I've been kind of playing the waiting game with him. Any pass rusher can have a big game here or there, maybe 2. But Koonce has played at an extremely high level for 3 of his last 5 or 6 games. He has 3 sacks and 3 forced fumbles over that period, and he's played more than half the defensive snaps in each of the last 2 weeks. There are reasons to hold off, and this almost made me not want to mention him. Crosby didn't play his usual sort of allocation of snaps last week, resulting in a bigger role than usual for Koonce, and the Chiefs are really not a good matchup for pass rushers. They've allowed only 1.5 sacks per game on average this season. I just couldn't ignore what Koonce was doing any longer, and this felt like the right time to mention him. I would probably wait a week if you are pretty healthy at the edge position, but for those who aren't, maybe you've been hit by injuries, you could do a lot worse than Koonce as an edge 4, I think.
Yeah, I can see him in that range. I would probably play Malcolm Koonce over Za'Darius Smith in that range.
Would you play him over Tyree Wilson?
Yeah.
Matt, which defensive lineman are you fading this week? Who is your feature guy?
Brian Burns is a guy that I think you look at and you think, oh, I got to start my studs. It's playoff time. Brian Burns has simply not been a stud this year. You might have drafted him to be that, but he's outside the top 50 D linemen in fantasy scoring for the season. He has not reached a double-digit fantasy point total since week 1. Maybe that differs some in your scoring format, but whatever your format is, he probably has not been very good. We've talked about some guys that haven't been getting sacks, but have been generating hidden pressures. That's not been Brian Burns, at least relative to what we should be getting from him. He's got 8 total pressures over the past 4 games. His team's offensive crappiness keeps opponents from needing to throw the ball. And he's got that matchup that I talked about earlier with Jordan Love, who's just not getting sacked a whole lot this year. So Brian Burns, not the stud that you hoped he was going to be. And there's not this huge ceiling that you need to worry about missing. I say go ahead and sit Brian Burns.
I struggle to rank Burns because I know he can be one of the better pass rushers in the league. But for whatever reason, whatever factors go into this, maybe a motivational thing, maybe he just wants out. He's not getting it done this year, and it's impossible to argue with that point, which as I say, pains me because I've got him in a bunch of places. So my guy, I want to talk about Khalil Mack in this spot. He's still my DL 21 or Edge 19, and I recognize that we're going to need to start him as a DL 2 in almost all formats this week. Had a really, really productive bounce back year. One of sort of very few bright spots on that Chargers defense. The only reason I have him here is because of his matchup. The Bills have allowed only 1.4 sacks per game this year, ranking first amongst all teams in the NFL. We've seen some teams have success against them in recent games, the Chiefs, for example, a few weeks back. But the way the Chargers are playing, I expect them to be behind early. And I expect the Bills to lean heavily on James Cook again. I mean, Mack needs just one good play to prove me wrong. All of these defensive linemen do, don't they? So maybe he takes down Allen early in the game before it gets too out of hand. But I don't want to bet on that happening. Not this week.
That's the tough part. They don't even need a good play. He needs like one play where Josh Allen gets flushed out from the other side, and he's like, "Oh, I got you." So that's always the tough part about these guys. For me, Khalil Mack, I agree with the factors you're mentioning. I would have a tough time setting him in my own lineup unless I had some really strong options. Like I could see myself playing Samson Ebukam over him. I don't think I could get to playing Jonathan Cooper over Khalil Mack, but it's one of those that absolutely could completely let you down this week because of those factors.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a Chargers fan, so I love what Mack's doing. Again, it pains me to mention him here, but yeah, can't allow bias to creep into these rankings. There's too much at stake, especially this time of year.
I mean, if you're a Chargers fan, then we're probably getting bias in the other direction where we shouldn't trust you because you're just too depressed to assess anything, right?
Exactly. So any other defensive lineman you don't like the look of this week?
Yeah, Andrew Van Ginkel is somebody that I tend to like more than the market, but that's not the case this week. He's got just a half sack since week 5. He does have some hidden pressure behind that might indicate he's going to break through at some point, but all those pressures that he's generated over the past 4 weeks came in a tremendous set of matchups. The Jets, the Commanders, the Titans, then the Jets again. So I think not that he's the guy that's going to keep generating pressures at that level and it's finally going to convert to sacks. I think instead he's the guy that's going to not generate those pressures this week and still not give us sacks. It's a crowded situation where even if Miami gets a couple sacks, they could easily get 3 of them and Van Ginkel could be left out of that. Bradley Chubb has been playing well. Zach Sealer's there. Christian Wilkins is there. So they have guys that can make the plays if opportunities do pop up. It is a worse matchup than those past 4 games that I mentioned. The Cowboys have been inconsistent in protection. They're not tough to sack. They're in the middle of the league in adjusted sack rate, but it's just not a great matchup. And they're in the bottom third of the league in terms of allowing fantasy points to defensive linemen. So Andrew Van Ginkel, maybe he gets there, but I don't think there's a great bet for him to do so. Tackle numbers haven't been great. I'd rather bench him this week.
Yes, fair enough. It sounds like I'm probably slightly higher on Van Ginkel than you. I love his story. I'm kind of willing him to do well every week. But the point I take that you made there is about how most of his production has come against inferior offensive lines. We could argue that he's just been unfortunate in terms of playing as a primary edge rusher in those games where he's playing against weaker offensive lines, but I'd be, again, cherry picking there, I think. So yeah, I take your point. I like him. I probably have him ranked higher than you do this week, but you make a good argument.
He's like low DL3 territory for me, maybe DL4. I have to see where he settles out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got this next guy in that same territory. I don't like to do that because I really dislike him as a player, but DJ Wonnum, consider sitting him if you have superior players. And I know this will ruffle feathers because he's had 9 sacks this year, regularly playing north of 90% of the snaps. Clearly, those are reasons to keep starting him if you must. He is a player who relies heavily on volume to produce. And like I said, there's no sign of his role reducing going forward, but he's produced against some pretty poor offensive lines, similarly to Van Ginkel. And the Lions, who face the Vikings this week, are better than most at protecting the quarterback. They've allowed only 2 sacks per game this year on average. And I think if anyone on this Vikings D is going to get a sack or 2 sacks against this team, it's likely to be Danielle Hunter, way above someone like Wonnum.
Yeah, he's just not as good as those sack numbers make him look. So I agree. And maybe it ends up working out. But, you talked about Van Ginkel. He's the guy who's been generating pressure and not getting the sacks lately. Wonnum's been getting the sacks and not generating the pressure to as high a degree. So, yeah, I'll probably have him ranked well below where most people do this week as well.
Mm-hmm. Who's your next guy in this same spot?
My remaining guy is Boye Mate, who's another player that you might look at his season numbers and think, oh, that guy got me a sack in like 27 straight games. I can't sit him in the fantasy playoffs, but he's got 1 QB hit in his past 5 games. He's got 2 QB hits among his past 7. He's a poor player in run defense. Maybe that decreases his playing time a little bit in this matchup. I'm not going to bet on that, but instead I'm just going to sit a guy that has been, he's been a very low floor player, and that floor is just not there for me this week. I've got him in mid DL4 territory, probably sitting Boye Mate if I can.
Another one that it pains me to admit, because he, like you say, had that run where he was really impressive, and I love the leap he's made this year. I think that bodes well for his future. Again, if we're talking dynasty, I'd be looking to go out and buy Mate. Interesting to see how he performs when they get Owusu back in the mix as well. But yeah, it's been a pretty barren spell of late. I always find it interesting when these guys, you look at the in-season splits. The first half of his season was fantastic. The latter half, if it continues, has been a massive drop off. So I'm kind of with you on Mate. I again want to rank him higher than I am, but it's difficult to do so when you look at his production over the last 4, 5, 6 games. My guy is Kayvon Thibodeaux, and this one again might ruffle some feathers. I'm not going to spend too long talking about him. I talked about him maybe like 3-4 weeks ago, and again a few weeks before that. I like his potential. I like him in Dynasty. I have him in a bunch of places, but I think he's been very fortunate to produce 13 sacks from only 37 pressures this year. And I think, again, another guy who's benefited from playing against some weak offensive lines. The Commanders twice and the Jets, 7 of his 13 sacks have come in those 3 games. All of that aside, I just don't fancy his chances of having a productive game against the Eagles this week. They've surrendered only 1.3 sacks in the last 3 games, tying the Saints, I think it is, for the fewest amount of sacks allowed over that span.
He's in kind of the same category as Khalil Mack for me. I would play Khalil Mack over Kayvon Thibodeaux, but in the same category in that I'd probably be scared to bench him, even though all the factors that you just mentioned, I agree with and are completely why he could certainly let you down this week. I would play Jonathan Cooper over him. I would play Samson Ebukam over Kayvon Thibodeaux this week.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready to talk about some defensive backs now, Matt?
Yeah, I like defensive backs less than the other positions, but I guess we have to hit it, right? People have to start them.
I'm in the same boat, but we need them. Other people do love them. Who is your featured guy? Who is your featured like at the defensive back position this week?
I will say overall, I tend to just get some fairly reliable defensive backs, because that's one of the things we don't like about them is that they're not that reliable. I tend to try to find some fairly reliable scorers through the season and then just sit on them rather than chasing matchups too much, because the further you get from the ball, the more it depends on game script. That said, the guys that I like, the first one's not like going out on a limb. I think people are going to like him this week. So I consider it confirmation that you should play him. Josh Metellus is the primary slot corner for Minnesota. He shouldn't need to be sold much. He's been giving you numbers this year. He should be active in this game against Detroit with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, and the running backs, heavily involved in the offense. There should just be plenty of opportunities. He's the kind of guy that should just be in your lineup every week at this point, and this week's matchup certainly should keep him there.
Agreed. Nothing to really add there. I've got him ranked as my DB8 this week, so you can see that I agree with what you said there. He's kind of been overshadowed by Cam Bynum a little bit this year, but he's been better than Harrison Smith. I had all three at one point in my top 12, and I felt justified at the time. This was just after Smith had started to recover after his poor start. But yeah, they've kind of separated a little bit. I've had Bynum in my top 3 or 4 pretty much all season. Metellus in that end of DB1, start of DB2 range most of the year. Smith's just been dropping like a stone, which I hate to say because he's been one of my favorite players over the course of the last decade plus.
It's funny that you should mention Harrison Smith because I know that we're jumping ahead to another guy that I have on my list, but Harrison Smith is a guy that I would go ahead and play this week a little bit higher than where he has been scoring for the season. For the year, his in-the-box snaps are up. His pass rush opportunities are way up. I know it's not a good matchup for sacks, but that kind of matchup can matter less for a DB because, Harrison Smith's not lining up on the shoulder of the tackle and trying to beat somebody one-on-one. He's going to blitz. So if they're having trouble getting to the quarterback without blitzing, that's all the more reason to try to blitz somebody. He's playing fine. Like, the production hasn't been there, but Harrison Smith's performance has been fine. And Detroit's been a positive scoring matchup for DBs. They're in the top 10 in that area. So for me, Harrison Smith is one of those guys where I'm like, I know that the numbers have not helped me necessarily get to where I am, but I'm going to go ahead and play him this week because I think he'll probably at least be okay. And he's the kind of player who can do it in so many areas that he could just have this blow up week that I kick myself all off season for missing.
No, I like the insight. I really want to see that kind of week from Smith. I think if he'd had interceptions this year, something he's made a name for himself by doing over the course of his career, that might have softened the blow a little bit. But I think with the tackle efficiency being down a bit, the interceptions and big plays not really being there outside of that one huge game where we had 3 sacks, that kind of it scares me off a little bit.
I tried not to overrate or underrate the lack of interceptions. I guess not so much underrate. I try not to overrate either the interceptions being there, like I mentioned with Tremaine Edmunds, or not being there with Harrison Smith. It makes me look at whether a player has been, changing anything about his role, and maybe not playing as much deep has contributed to there being fewer interceptions in the game, or, see if he's not playing up to par. And, I tend to look to Pro Football Focus grades for stuff like that because I'm not watching every game and saying, oh, Harrison Smith is not quite as good in coverage as he usually is in my studies of every single player. So as far as I can tell, it seems like he's playing close to his normal, and I know that he has that aptitude. So I'd rather go down with Harrison Smith than go down because I didn't play Harrison Smith, obviously, depending on who I'm deciding between, of course.
Fair points. The next guy that I wanted to talk up is Brandon Jones. He's had more opportunities than we expected this year. Injuries to Javon Holland and Deshaun Elliott have certainly helped, but we look for any edge we can get at this position, like I said. So if you're looking for a spot starter for week 16, I think you can do a lot worse than Jones. Clearly, we don't expect 2 interceptions every week. Like you, I prefer to look at that solid weekly floor, which is why I've got guys like, Winfield and Jesse Bates are bad examples. They're my 1 and 2 at the DB spot, but it's the reason why I've got someone like a Cam Bynum, I think he leads all safeties in tackles as my DB3 this week. I think Jones has the potential to have a big week as a tackler. 25 in his last 4 games that he started. I know there's a possibility that Elliott clears concussion protocol. I know there's a possibility that Holland comes back, but I think it just takes one of those guys to miss this week for Jones to have yet another good game. The Cowboys' offense has been kind to opposition safeties. So yeah, I think he's a pretty solid start, assuming either Holland or Jones misses time again.
Yeah, I agree with the opportunity he's facing. I agree with Brandon Jones being an upside guy when he gets that. He might be better off if Javon Holland's back and Deshaun Elliott's not. We don't usually see players miss 2 games with concussions, but Javon Holland is more of that back end player. And I think we tap into more of Brandon Jones's upside if he gets into the box, if he gets some pass rush chances. He's been playing deep more this year than in previous seasons. But even if he's playing deep, there are tackle opportunities in this Dallas matchup.
Yeah, as I say, just keep an eye on Holland and Elliott as the week unfolds to before you think about starting Jones is our advice, I guess.
And you mentioned those solid floor guys. I think maybe one other point that's not even player specific that's worth making is you got to look at your lineup and how many guys you start, because the bigger the lineup and the more steady producers you have, the easier it is to take a shot on somebody who is more boom bust. Like I said, with Harrison Smith, like if you have another very solid safety, some more reliable corners, some pretty reliable linebacker scorers, it's a lot easier to toss a guy in there that you say, maybe he only gets me 4 points this week, but if he has, if he grabs his first interception of the season, he could explode and win this week for me.
That's a great point. Who else are you championing at the DB spot, Matt?
One more guy is a guy that you're going to need to watch during the week. Devon Witherspoon has the injury that kept him out Monday night. If he's back active this week, unless we don't know how much he's going to play, I'm playing him because he's been terrific this year at a position that you can't usually count on week to week production. He's been giving it to us every week. He gets pass rush chances. So even if Tennessee isn't completing enough passes to get him tackle opportunities, they'll put him up there and have him rush the passer. I love the multi-category upside to Devon Witherspoon. As long as we're not getting a Pete Carroll like, we're going to hope that he's ready to go and we'll see. If he's gung-ho, if we get a full practice, I'm back in on Devon Witherspoon.
I'm all in on Witherspoon. I love him. He's been one of my top 5 corners since he really started stepping it up in this league, which didn't take him long, did it? He's superb. Love how he's playing. Let's hope he can make it back, and let's hope that we know that he's back well ahead of the weekend, as you said. Mm-hmm. I quite like what Kyle Hamilton has to offer this week. He's excelled as a player in his second year. That hasn't always translated into fantasy production. He's 32nd in tackles at the safety spot. And outside of that big week back in week 3, the big plays haven't really been there. They've been kind of few and far between. But the Ravens play the 49ers this weekend. And, Hamilton doesn't blitz often. Purdy's been super careful with the ball, but no team has allowed a higher rate of tackles to opposition safeties than the 49ers. So for that reason, I think Hamilton has a chance to produce a pretty solid weekly floor.
That's an interesting transition to the player I don't like side, because I actually list Kyle Hamilton as somebody that I don't like. His season production, fantasy-wise, I agree, has been playing fine, and I had him very high in my rankings to open the season. But his season production has been propped up by a couple of huge games. A 3-sack week against the Colts back in week 3, a pick 6 against Cleveland in week 10. Otherwise, just an okay player. And I mean, that doesn't mean you can't use him, but I think he's more like a low-end DB3 for this one. The 49ers have been the league's worst scoring matchup overall for DBs. I know they're supplying tackle opportunities to safeties, but they don't offer sack or turnover upside. So there's not that big game potential that I'm scared of missing if I sit Kyle Hamilton. And the Niners don't run a whole lot of plays, tied for 29th in the league. They're just too efficient on offense. They get off the field and it cuts down on overall tackle opportunities. So if I'm looking for a DB, or, if he's the guy that I've been starting every week and I don't want to reach for a matchup that might be a little bit better, I'm fine with leaving him in there. But there are definitely safeties that I'm starting over Kyle Hamilton this week.
I love that we've got a disagreement here. Finally, Matt, like a proper one. It's been far too much agreeing going on
That's
this
right.
show.
You just got to watch to the end for the fireworks.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm also sort of low-key interested in Xavier McKinney. His production has tailed away a little bit in the last few games. He had sort of that really sweet spell of sort of 4 consecutive games with 10 or more. But I think he can bounce back against the Eagles this weekend. They haven't been quite as nice a matchup for opposition safeties in recent games, but again, they still rank in the top 5 in terms of tackle efficiency to opposition safeties. So whether he can produce the big plays, I don't know. But again, I'm chasing this weekly floor, a position that is so volatile in terms of scoring.
Yeah, and that's why you chase that floor, because the turnovers are not something you can count on. Some guys are better at that than others, but Harrison Smith's very good at it, and he just doesn't get lucky in the interception category at times.
Well, now we've talked about him. He's going to come up with 3 this weekend, and
That's what
prove
I'm
you
trying to
right.
talk
Me
into
wrong.
existence is the big Harrison Smith week.
Yeah. So who do you want to feature in last section now? So who do you want to feature in your DB fades list? Who's the first guy you want to talk about?
I don't like Markquese Bell, and I wouldn't have planned on bringing him up, but it seems like he's still being prominently thought of in terms of starting DBs. He's just not scoring that way. There's nothing attractive about him. I think that people still see a safety starting at linebacker, and they're like, I'm going to start that guy and get the tackle upside. He's outside of the top 60 DB scorers for the season. He's got no double-digit fantasy totals for the year, at least by the balanced scoring system that I'm looking at for this. If you look at the Fantasy Pros consensus right now, he's inside the top 20. I think it's a mistake if you're using Markquese Bell this week at that level.
Yeah, he's another guy that I really want to be doing better. He should be doing better if he has safety designation in your league. But he is still trailing Clark in snap share, and like we talked about earlier on with another linebacker, it looks pretty healthy on a per week basis. But when you add that up over the course of the season, it hurts you. So yeah, I'm kind of with you on the Bell thing. I like how he's playing, but that matters for little in fantasy.
Yeah, at some point you just have to be like, it hasn't worked. What is the reason that I think it's suddenly going to do something this week?
So my guy is Richie Grant. This is an easy fade this week. The Falcons have been threatening to pivot to DeMarco Hellams now for about the last month or so. Even so, it was still a surprise to me, at least, to see that huge swing in snap share between the two guys last week. Grant's involvement dropped from around about sort of 75 to 80, 85 range to just 11%, while Hellams played almost every down. So it was one of 3 changes, I think, that the Falcons made to their defense. And Smith did talk about how those changes might not be permanent. But when you consider how well Hellams played, coupled with the fact that Grant has really struggled in multiple ways this year, I think it would be a surprise if this didn't continue into week 16 and beyond. Don't start Grant in week 16. Were you surprised to see that switch, Matt?
Yeah, very surprised. I mean, I would have thought that they viewed Richie Grant as a building block, and maybe they still do, and they just think that he needs a reset. But yeah, if anytime something happens like that, you have to assume, I think, that a player, especially at such a volatile position, is out of your consideration for the following week.
For sure. And it's at this point that I realize I could have mentioned Hellams amongst my DB likes. So opportunity missed, but yeah. So
you got to save something for them to come visit the site to get, right?
Absolutely. So Matt, can you name me 2 more guys you're shying away from at the DB spot this week?
Well, I already threw out Kyle Hamilton before being asked. So my other one is Kyle Duggar, and he's another player that's up in that high range of scoring that you might think, I got to start my studs this week. The Broncos are a negative scoring matchup for DBs. They have put up numbers in that category, like been more generous in that area over the past 3 games with passes defensed and interceptions up. Those came in losses to Houston and Detroit. You know, I mentioned earlier we get back to this New England-Denver matchup. Here we are, because I don't think the Patriots are actually good enough to press the Broncos into throwing the ball more than they want to. And that's been a key to the Broncos being a negative scoring matchup. Russell Wilson's been pretty good with the ball. It might be hard to remember that when he's not that far away from that 3 INT game against Houston. He's only thrown interceptions in 5 of his 14 games this season. So generally doing pretty well. Kyle Duggar only has 2 INTs this year, so it's not like he's been a ball hawk. He hasn't had a double-digit fantasy score since week 8, of course, depending on your format. So really, Kyle Duggar, I think, is a low floor guy here this week and doesn't have a ceiling that I'm worried about missing if I sit him for something that I think is more attractive. Kyle Duggar, I would sit for Harrison Smith, for example.
Interesting. I have Duggar ahead of Smith, but again, you make a good case. Duggar's been kind of so-so all year, hasn't been particularly disappointing, hasn't been particularly impressive either. If you've got him in your lineup still, you're probably still going to play him again in week 16, because what really are you expecting at this point? It's probably going to be more of the same. Don't like the matchup either. So my last 2 guys, I'll go back to back here. As you said, you've already mentioned Hamilton. Two talented players, Matt. Feels ashamed to mention him here. PJ Locke, he's a fade for me. Very few DBs have been as productive over the last month. He's got 26 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and 3 pass breakups in that span. But yeah, Kareem Jackson's back this week. Peyton did say some sort of encouraging stuff about wanting to keep Locke involved, and he'd be stupid not to, given how Locke has played. But it seems very likely to me that Jackson will impact Locke's snap share, or maybe Jackson will overtake that role completely again until the end of the year. So I'm just not willing to take that gamble at this point in the season on a DB when there's so many other guys that I could be starting in that spot. I mean, I say this knowing that Jackson isn't the same player as he used to be. Take out all the headhunting stuff. He hasn't played as well as he used to when he first arrived at the Broncos. But yeah, I think they go with Jackson over Locke. Maybe both of them play, and it hurts both of them. But either way, I think Locke, his value has dipped or will dip as a result of Jackson coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And then my next and our final nomination is, again, a pretty straightforward one, but also a bit of a head scratcher in terms of why. So it's Riq Woolen. I don't think there's any definitive reason as to why he was benched last week, has been being talked about, certainly by the Seahawks coaches, by Pete Carroll. And so I think we can hazard a guess, though, the missed tackles that were a problem for him last year, 19% or so, have kind of spilled over into this year as well. And I don't think it was any coincidence that he missed 3 tackle attempts the week before he effectively got benched. He was one of the best cover corners last year. We have to mention that. He went to the Pro Bowl. He had 6 interceptions, 9 pass breakups, allowed a really low passer rating in coverage. I forget what it was. It was somewhere in the 70s. But this year hasn't been terrible in coverage, but those missed tackles remain a problem. I expect him to play more than the 28% snap share he had last week, especially if Witherspoon misses more time. But again, why gamble at this point? If I've got any reservations about whether or not they're going to play 100% of the snaps, I'm out. I want nothing to do with it.
Yeah, cornerback brings enough risk. If they're going to add a risk factor, it's worth forgetting about it. Totally agree.
For sure. So look, that brings us to the end of what I've just realized is the last episode before Christmas. Matt, thanks for coming on. I've really enjoyed mixing it up with you on today's show. I hope you've had as much fun as I have.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I always like jumping on and talking defensive players, especially.
That's all good. It's all good. I'll have to have you back on again at some point. But look, I hope you have a wonderful Christmas with the family, and maybe let's hook up again in the new year for more of the same. For anyone who has been kind of hiding under a rock, can you remind our audience where to find you and your fantasy content?
Yeah, I'm on X at Schauf DS. It's SCHAUF. You can find all my stuff at draftsharks.com, rankings and all that. IDP content. I do IDP hits every Friday or Saturday, actually, this season, throughout the season, just kind of collecting all the IDP bits, things that I found while researching during the week, stuff that I think is going to matter. So you can go back and find all the back articles. You might still find some useful stuff there. I looked at actually some rookie linebackers that are worth stashing in Dynasty for next year and beyond in one of those recent ones, trying to give people who might have been out of the playoffs something to still use from there. So yeah, check out draftsharks.com. And, Jase, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate having this opportunity.
Pleasure's been all mine, Matt. It's been great to catch up with you and talk about, as we talked about off air before we started, our favorite subject, right? Doesn't get any better than this. So yeah, if you aren't already following Matt, go and do so. Shame on you, and go and do so and support his work. You can also chuck me a follow as well if you want to. I'm on X at Jase Abbey. My weekly rankings are over on the IDPshow.com. I'll be back next Wednesday to bring you more of the same for week 17. And in the meantime, happy holidays. Good luck to those who are still in playoff contention. And thanks for tuning in.